Welcome to the Chiefs. The Chiefs is a Whiteark podcast aimed at specifically giving you an insight into what makes great leaders and entrepreneurs in a variety of organisations tick. We call them Chiefs. My name is James Ciuffetelli, and together with my Whiteark co-chief, Jo Hands, we're going to attempt to take you on a journey and talk to as many chiefs across as many industries as we can to give you an insight into A, what makes them tick, and B, what makes their enterprises thrive, and more importantly, what they've learnt along the way. The Chiefs.
I'm very, very excited today to be holding a panel event with three industry experts. So I'll give you a little bit of a preamble. I'm going to get the guys to introduce themselves. I'm going to get into a whole bunch of questions. And today really is about sharing knowledge, right? And at the topic of today's presentation is the power of data and the value of data and analytics in this current environment in terms of the uncertainty that we're currently facing into. And how do we use data and analytics to really drive decision making in our organizations and make sure that we work out how to navigate through the period that we're in and what does the future look like. And I think data and analytics is a hot topic and it's always been important, but it's more important than it's ever been. And so today is about giving you some expert advice. I laugh, but expert advice and some different perspectives on actually how to think about data analytics, how to think about the current environment that we're in from an uncertainty perspective, and how to think about how that applies to your business and give you practical insights. So I wanted to welcome you to the Whiteark panel event today. My name is Jo Hands, for people who don't know me. I'm the co-founder of Whiteark, and we are a consultancy firm that focuses on transformational change in organisations and private equity consultation and transition work. Our focus is on practical hands-on experience in working with you to navigate what you need to do in your organisation. And White, in our name, reflects the Edward de Bono hat that is about data and analytics that drives an outcome. Our whole philosophy and approach is how do you use data and analytics to understand where you're at and to be able to forecast and predict where you should go and actually drive the operations and the strategy of your business. So today we are talking to a panel of three people. So I'm going to get Matt Rudd to introduce himself first.
Thanks very much, Jo. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks again, Jo, and the Whiteark team for inviting me to be part of this panel discussion today. Really grateful for the opportunity and looking forward to the discussion. I've been working in various forms of data and analytics for nearly 25 years now, always in the guise of looking how I might use data and information to better inform what could or should happen next. I started my career actually in applied research, and I spent nearly 10 years in research, initially as a virologist working at the CSIRO, Animal Health Laboratory in Geelong, which is obviously quite a topical career at the moment, where I was developing new diagnostic tests and then working in the UK using bioinformatics to identify susceptibility alleles for various cancers. More recently, I've spent nearly 15 years in corporate organisations, initially working in finance at Morgan Stanley, the investment bank, and then really focusing on the development of reporting and analytics capabilities, both at Census and Swinburne University of Technology. I guess in my current role as Director of Business Analytics at Swinburne, I guess I have seen firsthand, the profound impact that COVID-19 has had, not only on the broader economy, but particularly on the education sector. And I think our team has a really important role, to play in supporting that decisive decision-making, to try and prosper in the new environment.
That's fantastic. And some really great knowledge coming up from Matt through this conversation. So thank you so much, Matt. And I've been lucky enough to work with Matt at Census. So he's an absolute fantastic operator. So I'm very, very happy to have on the panel today Charlie Nelson, and anyone who follows Whiteark will see that Charlie actually did an article this week around uncertainty, very topical, but just hoping you can introduce yourself, Charlie.
Thanks, Jo. Hello, everybody. It's great to be here. My business, Foreseechange, has been providing forecasting, modelling and analytical services for quite some time now. We focus on the macro environment and then drill down to individual industries. And over the past 40 plus years that I've been observing the Australian economy and consumer spending. We've had periods of increased uncertainty and economic slowdowns, but nothing like 2020. This has certainly been the most complex and unique, challenging period that we've faced. What we've needed during this period is near real-time data to help us understand the changing consumer and the economy, because it's all changing so quickly, almost week by week. And now we're entering a new phase where there's still uncertainty. The economy's picked up a little bit, but there's still uncertainty given that the government's withdrawing income support. We don't quite know when the vaccine's going to arrive and how good it's going to be and how long it'll take to roll out. And so we've got concerns too about our two biggest trading partners and allies in the United States and China. There's a lot going on there. And so this means we need to continue with that near real-time data throughout this year to help us make sure that we understand how to adapt our strategy quickly.
Yeah, it's 100% right, isn't it? And I think it's how companies actually be able to navigate this change. It's going to either set them up for success. It's going to be a pivotal moment in every company's life about what do they do next, right? And how they navigate through this. So thank you so much. Looking forward to talking to you today, Charlie. And Tony, over to you to introduce yourself.
My name's Tony Xu. I'm the Senior Product Manager for Fulfillment, Delivery and Customer out at Catch. Before this, I've had a varied career across product and analytics. I was a CTO and a co-founder of an e-commerce fulfillment startup backed by Post called Fulfillio, and also a director of product out at Yellow Pages at Census. So in my background, it's really always been focused on using data analytics as a core discipline to drive customer-facing features, identifying where those pools of value for a customer and a product, and executing either a development change, a new physical product offering or something like that to go and capitalize on that. And I think, COVID's probably reduced the amount of big levers companies have to move their dial. It's turned them into much smaller, much more personalized initiatives and to deliver a lot of them at a higher velocity. And so I'm really interested to see how the world pans out. There's the ability of companies to do big, interest rate changes on their business, or small personalizations of value pools to drive outcomes. So that's a bit about me.
Fantastic. So as you can see, we've got a wealth of knowledge, different industries, different experiences on the panel today. And today is about providing some insights, some practical experience and some information to the people who are listening to this today. Also, as we're going through, we're going to be running some polls with the audience. So the poll should pop up on your screen. You should be able to answer it. And then ultimately, I'll be able to show you what the results of the poll says. So we'll try and keep that topical and really see what the audience here today is thinking about some of these topics that the panelists are discussing. So I want to jump right in. We've got a lot to talk about. So I want to start with uncertainty. And I'm going to actually ask my first question to Charlie. So, the word uncertainty kind of sums up 2020, right? So how can businesses use data and macro trends to provide some certainty post-COVID? And what does that look like for companies, and how should they think about this uncertainty? And just before you answer, I'm about to hand over to you, I'm going to do a poll to the audience in relation to what are you most uncertain about? So I'll allow you to answer that while Charlie answers the question around uncertainty.
Okay, well, thank you, Jo. It's been a roller coaster for consumers. Their emotions have swung all over the place, and the real-time data I spoke about, the fast data it's sometimes called, gives us information that's almost up to date as things happen. We're getting information from banks about consumer spending via cards. We're getting information from a tax office to help us understand what's happening to companies through payroll data. And obviously the medical professions needed up-to-date data in order to understand how to manage this COVID pandemic. The data is not only up to date, but it's typically also much more detailed about locality, demographics, or industry. And this has been very important for the government and companies to tap into to understand how quickly things are changing and how agile they need to be to go on to the next stage. Going into 2021, there's still uncertainty, so we can never rely on being certain about what's going to happen. What we need to do is to anticipate what could happen and have plans for different scenarios. That could include, for example, in the economy, how quickly the government withdraws financial support, or do they change their tack along the way and decide they need to provide more? And so the only way to cope with all of these changes is to have a range of plans that handle a specific scenario and rehearse those plans so that we're ready to adapt very quickly as soon as something changes.
Yeah, I really like that idea of scenario analysis. I think it's probably been an underutilized thing that a lot of companies haven't done a great job of. And it's, I think, a really important part of thinking about how to navigate that uncertainty is having scenarios and then working through what those impacts could be.
The information is often there. I mentioned in that article that back in 2010, the Financial Review had a scenario which was very like the situation we're in now, where there was a pandemic, millions died, economies went into recession, and 10 years later, well, here it is. So we had notice, but even governments didn't really take advantage of that notice, make plans.
I think if I could just jump in and add to what Charlie's mentioned, I think this need for real-time data and the availability of it, I think, as you've seen just through even things like tracing and tracking and quarantining has been critical. But the other thing we're looking at, I guess, is some of those big, macro signals that we're getting to help plan for the next 2 to 3 years, particularly I think from an education sector, the disruption that this has caused is monumental. We will look at the scan and what I guess we're currently grappling with. You've got Australia managing the virus reasonably well. I think there was a single new case yesterday, right? So the trajectory there is good. You've got domestic travel beginning to return to normal, right? And I think with that, you'll see significant growth in national business activity, right? Which will mean for businesses that are largely domestic facing, you should see things return to quasi-normal, if not a little bit of a bubble initially. I think there's a lot of pent-up demand amongst consumers. And I think you couple that with this massive government stimulus that has been happening and continues to happen and will continue, particularly in infrastructure. Right, and I think you'll see that offset some of these job support packages that are being rescinded. And then I think there's Pfizer vaccine announcement, right, to be rolled out in Britain next week. You've got probably US FDA approval for vaccines the following week. It's creating this enormous optimism, which will only grow as more vaccines come on the market. And I think you saw the Treasurer say, just the other day that the early vaccine and the boost to the economy is worth, $34 billion to the economy alone. So those types of things we look at, but on the downside for us, rates of international, COVID aren't great, right? And so you pretty much would need to rule out a lot of international travel and trade, certainly until there's a vaccination schedule. And I think the other thing for us, the geopolitical events and what that means for visitors to Australia, right? And particularly from an education sector, what that means for international students is something, we're concerned about. And I think the big stat there for us is 300 students have entered Australia under pilot programs since COVID broke out. There are 135,000 enrolled international students that aren't able to come and study on campus. And so what happens there, when are they going to be able to come back? That's probably the elephant in the room in terms of planning for the next few years. And yes, there is data, but it's largely at the control of good health measures and policy.
That's the uncertainty indeed. We did get some very good news on the domestic economy yesterday. New vehicle sales for November, which is virtually as close as you can get to real-time data. Seasonally adjusted data was the best in over 2.5 years. So there's no doubt that the domestic economy is picking up quite nicely. Some of that is pent-up demand, of course, because Victoria haven't been able to buy cars for a little while.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm going to actually share the results of the poll. So interesting to see that we know from talking to our Whiteark clients that they're uncertain, right? And this whole concept of uncertainty. And you can see from the results from the poll that, pivoting to meet customer demands and the redundant business model. So what does that business model need to look like, right? Because of where we are in this kind of post-COVID cycle. And I thought, Tony, maybe you could talk a little bit about pivoting to meet customer demands in terms of at Catch, because it's a really interesting thing that Catch has had to navigate through this COVID period.
I think there's a couple of things in that, right? Pivoting, Catch has been an online retailer, and then suddenly during this period, it's almost become a one-stop shop for everyone, right? To become a kind of specialty retailer and then to suddenly become a general purpose retailer is a massive expansion of stock, is a massive expansion of range, obviously, and fulfillment and that kind of infrastructure to back that up. I think the really interesting thing about pivoting to meet your customer expectations is we underestimate sometimes how hard it is to get a customer experience simple. Right? You look at it's a very simple thing to say Amazon's very simple, or Afterpay has a very simple product and a very simple user experience. There's hundreds of thousands of people hours that come down to 2 touch points in the customer journey. And I think, pivoting to meet customer demands, for me, sometimes getting the actual experience right is the easy part. The downstream effects to the business are huge. And I think that's the part that I think the second part of the poll that really hits home is once you've got pivoted to meet your customer expectations, you kind of sit sometimes with a bit of a redundant business model that was used to serve X, but now needs to serve something else. And that's the big transformation piece that ends up happening, because as you grow a certain channel of customer experience, you've got to force almost the organisation to grow around that. Otherwise, your organisation tends to throw it away, kind of like what some of the bricks and mortar retailers have done to their online operations. Right? If they got the customer experience more or less broadly right, then the whole business model was refused to pivot around that new experience, and so you get that disconnect.
Yeah, and so many failures or things that happen in business where businesses underperform is because they haven't pivoted quick enough from a business model perspective, right, to the new thing and to the next thing. And so it's, I suppose in this period, how do you get the information to work out what that pivot needs to look like and the timing of that pivot? Do you have a view on that, Charlie? Do you have a thought process around that?
Well, it's a very difficult subject to pivot quickly. You've got to know what you want to pivot to. And so the information on consumers changing behaviour is very important. I do notice in the statistics on retail that immediately the shutdown started in response to the pandemic, that online retail sales jumped tremendously, and it's now both for food and non-food retail, it's now much higher as a percentage of the total than it would have been under past trends in about 4 years' time. So organisations like Tony's and others like Kogan have been able to implement change very, very quickly and take advantage of these very quick changes.
Yeah, you're seeing where companies had their digital strategy right, really be able to capitalise right on this, and people who haven't been able to have their digital strategy right really probably miss out, right? So I want to change gears a little bit. I'm going to hand to Maddie as a starting point in terms of actionable insights. So there is an unbelievable amount of data that most companies and from an economic perspective we've got. But the question is, what's your advice, experience about how do you turn that data into things that can be actioned to actually drive a difference, right, and an outcome?
Yeah, thanks, Jo. I think this challenge for me is particularly interesting. I always certainly hear phrases like actionable insights and embedded analytics, and honestly, sometimes I get filled with this sense of panic, right, that everyone else is doing it, and these advances in software and insights should arise even more easily. But I think in truth, most businesses find it really challenging, right? And I think the reason for that is good insights are dependent on a number of things happening in concert. So I've always looked at that familiar sort of hierarchical idea of data as a foundational element, right? And you then go and curate that and organise that and you provide information, via reports and dashboards, and that's how people consume it. But in order to really get those insights out, someone needs to sit down and analyse all that information, right? They need to draw relevant conclusions. They need to make them clearly known to people who are in a position of influence, right? And they need to do all of this in a really timely fashion to make sure that you can affect some sort of change. And so in other words, really a lot has to go right, for all of this to occur. And I think this is why you always see those polls. Many companies know that it's important, but so few feel that they're actually hitting the mark. And you'll see it time and time again. 90+% say they should be doing it. 20% will say that they're doing it well. I just had a really quick think. I think there's probably 5 things for me, or sort of significant challenges and maybe some potential strategies. And this is just from my perspective. The first one that I observe is it takes time, right? And I know our team is guilty of, by the time we spend all the time sourcing data and modelling the data and integrating it and building reports and convey the information, we actually never have time to do that last mile. I find that we're always just hitting deadlines for providing information, but we're not hitting deadlines. We're not allowing ourselves the time to do the valuable bit at the very end. And the other side, I think, is it takes time for those that need to respond to get across it. You need to get them across what it is, and they need to devise something that's sort of an appropriate action. So there's a couple of things we're doing there. The first is we're actually trialling something in our team where we reduce the time spent building glossy reports and information and publications, and we're actually doing it the other way. And we're just literally going, for a very bare bones approach to get the insight and test the hypothesis that we started the work for, talk with the business, and then work out whether we need to do something, full tilt and glossy and sort of commercial grade retrospectively, because I think the value is in the last bit, not in all the bits that go before it. I think the other thing we've tried to do is to actually make draft recommendations ourselves, right? So where we wait for the business to do it and sort of cotton on, I find if you put something in front of them, it forces a response, right? Here are our recommendations. Now, they might disagree with those, but the moment you do that, it creates an impetus, right, to do something, to either refute it or to look at it and agree with it. And so we've tried to be a little more proactive and, beg people's forgiveness that we'll put some recommendations forward, even though it's not our business decision. So that's the first. I think it requires subject matter expertise, and both the data side, but also on the business side, to make sure you're making those correct inferences and assumptions, and you recognize the limitations. And I think in my experience, the SMEs are always the ones that are in short supply and high demand. And that's a perennial problem, right? So the insights that you're working on have to be aligned to the key goals of the business. So that alignment is critical, because if you're not focusing on something they care about, they just won't prioritize it. I think the third thing for us is that actionable insights, they require that key figures in the business are engaged, right, and take direct action or mandate action as soon as needed, normally in response to something that's happening right now. And so a lot of the models that we've developed, they'll have some sort of annual or cyclical, they'll support a cyclical process. And if we don't act on the opportunity quickly to improve some outcomes, then an opportunity to do that doesn't come around for a long time. And by then, things have probably materially changed and you've lost the initiative anyway. So sort of that relevance is key. It's got to be relevant at that point in time to be important. I think it's got to be clearly communicated, right? Despite all the good work, you can do some great work, but if you can't communicate it, you just won't get the traction. And I think this is tricky when you're doing sort of complex modelling and analytics to try and communicate that. And it requires some literacy on both sides and the ability to translate, right? And you're starting to see a lot of roles for analytical translation online because people recognise this is a problem where they do some great work, but that doesn't quite hit home. We find if we work through with the business right from the get-go and we catch up regularly and we sort of talk through things like assumptions and logic right from the start, we get a lot better buy-in than sort of hitting them with a package and a product at the end, and it's almost overwhelming. I guess the last challenge we have around insights is the issue of resistance to change, right? And people are uncertain about how robust those insights are in the first place. Is the underlying information correct? Does it conform to how we interpret the business? Does it reconcile? Was the training rigorous? All of these critiques to try and not change, because it change is hard, and making a change and moving, activity or people. And so we find that a real challenge. And I think, one way we address this is where we know it's something meaningful, and we've done a lot of work, is we'll actually do a lot of that documentation and write it up as a paper and publish it, or put it as a wiki document and give them time to consume it, go through it. We're very honest with what we've done and what didn't work and what the results were. And so if you're transparent and you communicate that clearly, I find that people are a lot more bought in. But as I said, for me, the insights, a lot has to go right, and you have to focus time on it, or it sort of amounts to nothing.
Yeah, and one of the things that I took away from that, Matt, there's a couple of things, but one of them was that business SME person that wants to make the change, right? Because actually from knowledge to actually being able to execute, that's where generally things fall down.
Correct. Someone's got to do something different off the back of that.
Yeah.
They're very reluctant to do it unless they fully understand it, right? Unless they're confident that it's going to translate as you said it would, and that just takes investment.
Yeah, and Nathan Parker just put a chat note saying speed to insight is paramount. It's a really good point, which is, and it's becoming more and more important about how quickly you can actually go, we've got the data, we've got the insight, and actually how we're going to execute it. And it's your point, Matt, not spending so much time on a PowerPoint pack or how you actually package it up, but test the hypothesis and get it in front of people as quickly as you possibly can, because that speed is probably going to be a differentiator, right? And how quickly you respond. So the poll was around, where does your company require most assistance in data and insights. And interestingly, it's coming back to the trend, yes, all of the above, but coming back to this whole trend about customer and consumer behaviour. And I'm actually going to throw to Charlie on this, because there's this element that the world we've known and the customer that we've known and the consumer that we've known has changed. And businesses are grappling with how do they respond and adapt to that. I'm interested in your perspective. I know you've touched on components of it, but this whole customer consumer behaviour, and I know that you do some survey on this for some of your clients, so it'd be interesting to give some perspective on that.
Definitely, yeah, thanks. I'd like to pick up one point that Matt made about resistance to change, because that's very important, I find. You know, while we're talking about uncertainty, there's a lot of changes which are totally predictable. We know they're happening slowly, but they can't be revoked. One of those is the ageing population. You know, we've known since the 1970s that the overall population was going to age, and that we would have a problem with funding retirements. And also we knew that marketing had to adapt to sell products to older consumers. But in so many agencies, they're still focused on youth. Now, it's the older consumer who typically has more money to spend, and the over 50s have got about 70% of the total wealth of the country. And so this is a change that's been predictable for decades and still hasn't really been picked up properly by marketers and also governments with respect to, for example, aged care requirements. And the pandemic has decimated the aged care policy clearly. The other one is climate change. We've known about that for a long time. When it was 1992 when the Rio meeting agreed to avoid dangerous climate change, and yet total carbon dioxide in the atmosphere still keeps going up. So, you know, we do need to embrace change, even when we're not sure what it's going to be. In this case, those cases we are sure. But often when we're not sure what that change is going to be, well, we have to just make sure we've got that fast data, we've got the finger on the pulse. And sometimes you have to use imagination to support that, and sometimes you have to take a risk. But if you don't do that, you're going to be left behind by somebody else.
Yeah, fail fast, take a risk, try things.
I think the difficulty for a lot of businesses that you see that come through, you know, I'll say, for example, say Afterpay in this area, even Eastall Logistics, who's a logistics provider now that's got crazy volumes, is it takes a long time to sit in front of the wave for that wave to come. And when it does come, it's usually bigger and a heck of a lot faster, and it comes a lot faster than you expect. But, you know, it takes a long time. And so for a lot of businesses, they will go extinct if they're too far ahead of the curve, because it's really uncomfortable growing 5% a year on low growth, and then suddenly the consumer trends on sustainability have changed. So sustainable packaging companies are going through the roof, whereas 2 or 3 years ago they were nowhere to be seen, or they were just kind of ambling along at low rates. And same with, you know, anything in the aged care startup area is getting funding left, right and centre, where they would have struggled 2 or 3 years ago. There's a huge amount of luck. I wouldn't say luck, but there's a huge amount of being able to pick the right timing and to do a fast follower strategy. And the companies that have been able to do that, I think, you know, probably Microsoft has done that fantastically in the cloud space. When you think about a 7-year head leap that AWS had, the companies are able to do that fast follow, and obviously Facebook and Instagram are just absolute machines at doing that. Being able to do that is more important than ever, because I think the consumer shifts are going to come, and they're going to come suddenly. And we've got 7 billion people on the planet, so you're going to get a lot of demand that gets unlocked in the space of 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, and going back to a point I think we were talking about earlier around this whole move to digital that we've seen and how quickly we've accelerated to digital and online and all of that, you know, you'd expect that that's only going to continue, right? And it's more at what is the rate it is going to continue. But the fact that we've accelerated to that point isn't going to reverse. It's really about what the trend is in the future, and it's how you're going to drive that trend rather than just respond to that trend. So I
think also not to underestimate that this has done a lot of good for a lot of industries and businesses as well.
Yes.
Because I think I would reflect and say that it's forced a lot of industries that knew they needed to make change that were struggling against a whole lot of other priorities to suddenly double down on the investment in, digitizing their products and services and making it more accessible, because ultimately I think a lot of consumers, that's what they wanted, right? And we're frustrated by, I'll just again take the education example, but the students were really wanted and were often voting with the idea that they want to consume academic information anywhere, anytime, anyhow, and the idea of turning up to campus and is sort of a redundant philosophy. Now that comes with implications for what is the university of the future, and et cetera, and that opens a whole another set of problems. But students are digitally native and quite keen to embrace that, and universities have been potentially a little slow. Well, now they've all invested in that. Equally, IGA supermarket, and the fact I don't have to go in there now, I can just click and collect. I don't think they even had that capability 12 months ago. So I think there's a lot of good that's come from this, a lot of convenience as well.
Yeah, and a lot of companies have said, actually, things that would normally take us a year to do a project, we had to do in a couple of weeks because we had no choice, because we were in crisis. And we realised that we were actually more agile and adaptable, and we didn't need to do a business case, and we actually made quick decision making because we didn't have a choice. And so how do you take that crisis, the good of the crisis mode, and the ability that an organisation can move quickly, and actually translate that into how you work operationally, right? So that it becomes kind of inbuilt in how things work.
I think a lot of the time the risk rewards in a crisis are different. You have very few business leaders that are happy to run a huge risk book over time for growth. They generally stay in the startup world, or they're family-owned businesses, and they're very rarely corporate leaders who run very large amounts of business risk in order to grow their companies quickly, because the payoffs just aren't there. From a corporate perspective, when you're a very large entity, they are there when you're VC funded. I think a crisis is different, right? Because the risk to not doing anything is so much that you're forced to make those quick decisions without, like a startup, like an SME, because it's a battle for survival. I suspect once you make them now, there's going to be a whole 6 to 12 months transformation across the board, while every department gets lined up around what the new status quo is. But I think a lot of times the risk reward just isn't there. You can understand that unless there's a crisis that kind of brews.
Yeah, I agree with you, but it does show you that companies can move quicker if they want to, right? And I think this is a good segue into the next conversation I wanted to have about planning. So a lot of people are sitting here going, we reset our targets for 2020, whether or not you're on a June financial year or a December financial year, because we had to, right? We had to reset what we really thought, whether that's going to be way more positive or way more negative or somewhere in between. But people are now needing, really thinking about the new calendar year as a bit of a fresh start. So keen to get your view, Charlie, on, what some of the things that people should be thinking about as they're planning for 2021.
I think the first thing is that population growth has slowed dramatically and won't improve very soon. We've been used to 1.6% population growth over the last decade, and we'd be lucky to be getting 5.5% now because there's pretty much zero migration. That won't change, at least for 6 months, I shouldn't think. And that underpins economic growth, of course. So it means that while we're recovering quite nicely, economic growth is going to still be slow. And of course, it is supported by government spending. They would be wanting to withdraw some of that income support. And so that will also tend to slow the economy. Exports is a problem for Australia. Exports is 20% of our economy, and it's been in recession for a year. Of course, that's been hit hard by international tourism, which is one of our top 4 exports, and also education, which is one of our top 4 exports. And with China behaving the way they are, our export markets, exports for other commodities are threatened. So there's an issue there. There's also an issue of business investment, which is about 20% of the economy. Business has got plenty of encouragement from government to invest, but they're reluctant to do so until they see good evidence that the demand is there in the economy. So that's where the consumer is so important, which represents about 60% of the economy. And it's very important to keep the finger on the pulse with regard to the consumer. Our latest data, which came out last week, so it's late November, shows that consumers are still very determined to build savings. Over this year so far, they've built up an extra $100 billion, $100 billion in savings, in part because they couldn't spend on some things, and in part because they've seen an opportunity to save for something. And we've got a boom in first home buyers at the moment because potential first home buyers have seen the opportunity with a bit of saving to get into the market because house prices paused a little bit, interest rates are very low, they've been able to tap into superannuation, and so that's a boom market at the moment. But consumers are also saving for a rainy day, precautionary saving. Now, when they feel ready to spend some of that money and save less, okay, that they will spend more, but we don't quite know when that is yet. Other issues or items that consumers are saving for include a holiday. Now that things are opening up, there's certainly more saving for domestic travel, and we're seeing saving for a car pick up a little bit. I already mentioned automotive. That looks like picking up after 3 bad years. Also, some consumers have lifted their saving priority for retirement. Not surprisingly, perhaps, when interest rates are so low and they've had to save more to enable them to have a longer financial retirement. And so saving is tomorrow's spending. And the big question is, well, how soon will that turn around from building savings to releasing those savings? And that's what we need to monitor very carefully. And we do that pretty frequently, so we can keep clients informed on that. There is uncertainty with the timing of the vaccine, the timing of consumers being more ready to spend, and we just need to keep the finger on the pulse and ready to take advantage of changes when they happen.
Yeah. And what we know is there's lots of money being built up that people are saving. So it's, what's the next thing that they're going to spend that money on? And it sounded like, we were predicting cars, and we've even seen that for the month of November, right? So it's a lot of the data that we've had about what that is going to look like is starting to come through. And it is starting to come through now in the last couple of months as consumers have become less fearful for the future with the news of the vaccine and with the more confidence in the economy. Yeah, it's fantastic, Charlie. And Tony, I wanted to ask you, to give maybe some practical examples around how you're thinking about planning for the new year in kind of resetting, using some data and analytical insight. How are you thinking about planning from a catch perspective?
I think a lot of the work will be around, kind of alluded to it earlier, where a lot of the larger initiatives, the big macro things are starting to lose their effect across organisations. They've done a lot of them. And so some of the newer ways of driving value are getting deeper down into the value pools. So it's things like personalisation. The example I give is, the driver tree used to stop for most organisations at first or second level. And now a lot of the hunting for value is going to be in the third, fourth or fifth level. It's going to be a certain customer segment inside a certain area that has a high propensity to spend. Can we deliver them the right goods and services? Can we help them? Can we grow that segment aggressively and turn more of the users that are currently on our platform into those particular segments? So as we plan for, 2021, a lot of my thought processes are around, getting finer grained in how I release products and getting the right customer segment to the right product and matched up, and using a data analytics to both get a feel for where those customer value pools are, but also how it successfully capturing the customer wallet and the customer share in those pools.
Yeah, really, really interesting insight, and kind of back to that whole customer demand piece, really understanding what that looks like. So I wanted to pivot the conversation a little bit and talk about data and analytical tools. So a lot of people, when we have conversations with them around data and analytics, they ask a lot of questions about what tools do we use and how should these tools be applied. And so, Matt, I was really keen to get your perspective on how do you think about data and analytics tools, and what do you think is important to consider and think about when you're thinking about what are the right tools for certain businesses from a data and analytics perspective?
Yeah, look, I'd probably start by saying I do think there's a lot of pressure on businesses, right, to try and continue to invest in the latest platform and service, and there's a lot of very compelling, marketing activity going on, for fear of falling behind. But actually, I think a lot of businesses, a lot of value is left on the table just in terms of getting the simple things right in a timely and sort of consistent fashion. And so for me, really good processes and clear priorities and good engagement between data teams and the business are actually the most valuable activity. In terms of the perfect set of tools, look, I don't think there is a perfect set of tools. I think it is obviously very dependent on each organisation's particular circumstances, things like their attitudes to cost and security. I think obviously paramount, particularly data security and potentially data sovereignty. The capability of staff, the latent skills that you already have in the organisation, what existing infrastructure do you already have and what commitments have you made? And then things around, what is the expectation around output and presentation and what are the user's own personal preferences? I think that has to come into it. I think from our perspective, just to address the question specifically, we don't have a huge suite of tools. The university more broadly has a massive array of tools at its disposal. I think from our team, we use Amazon Web Services. We started using them 5 years ago, so we land our data in Amazon S3. We use Matillion for all of our ETL and data modeling work. We use Redshift for relational querying, and we use Tableau as our analytics and visualization tool of choice. And we've done that for about 4.5, 5 years to great effect, right? And we've actually gone through a big process of governing the data that we report, and we've trained nearly 1,000 users, and people are really comfortable with the look and feel and what they get. I think over and above that, obviously our team has to do a lot of other things other than just sort of reporting and information provision. So they use everything from SQL to SAS to SPSS modeler. But then a lot of our modeling is done, sort of machine learning and optimization is done using R and Python and tools like that. So we are constantly, though, on the lookout for new tools, particularly where it makes sense in terms of cost or security or make things more accessible. So we're continuing to look at the Amazon stack and some of the things that got released and announced this week. We've done some client work with clients with Snowflake and Alteryx and had really good feedback. And obviously things like Power BI and ThoughtSpot and some of these new relational search tools. So I would reiterate, though, I think while all of these are great, they're really just sort of setting the scene. All these tools are just setting the stage for that insight discovery. And so the tools themselves are important, but I think it's the process that's the important thing.
Yeah, no, I would agree with you. And I think it feeds into the next thing I wanted to have a conversation with, and I'm going to throw to Tony on this one. But, you mentioned it, Matt, and it's been mentioned a couple of times on this panel today is around capability, right? And having the right SMEs and having the right capability. And so you can have all the tools in the world, but if you don't have the right capability in your team to be able to have the right conversations and work out how to actually convert the data and analytics into something that is an actionable insight, you're kind of missing the magic right on that. So, Tony, I'm interested in your view on capability. So what do you think the key 3 or 4 capabilities are that are critical for your team to be able to make sure that we're getting the most out of the data and insight piece so that the business can really move quickly on actionable insights?
I think for me, there's 2 parts that are really, really core to me. The first one is the ETL speed. So much of time inside data is spent massaging, mapping, and the like. So, tools like Alteryx, enable AWS Glue. I like Alteryx. I think it's my favourite software by far. Really shorten the amount of time needed to get data into the right format for insights. The second part of it, I think, is starting to grow out as a discipline, which is that so many good companies know so much about their customers now at a management level, right? At a managerial and executive level, there are dashboards for customer insights, customer behavior, and all these things. But these are really difficult to unlock. If you ask your customer to come along, they'll be like, this is great. Can you tell me these things? Or, if you're a B2B business and you show them a dashboard that management normally sees for their operations. And the B2B seller's like, I'd love this to me to take up to my managerial team. And so I think there's a discipline that's going to really start occurring, and one that I've stressed a lot in my teams, which is around productionizing that data. And that's a different skill set generally to what is available in traditional data teams. So these are AWS Lambda, the ability to build microservices, to build API endpoints, and to work inside an agile delivery train, and to speak the language of JavaScript developers and, front end and back end. What I suspect coming in the next, I'd say circa 5 to 7 years, is a lot of the back end microservices are currently built by engineering teams are going to be starting to be built by data teams, because the speed to insight from the data team is actually much quicker than trying to do it out of an existing kind of JavaScript layer or MySQL database that runs your website. The data guys actually have a much richer view, and I think that over the next few years, that discipline of productionizing and providing content through to the end user is going to be a growing part. And everyone just loves how Google auto-completes or LinkedIn auto-completes what they want to do, right? It's a very similar experience.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And I know, Matt, you and I have had a couple of conversations about a model that you'd built at the universities around training students on, this whole data and analytics piece and how they actually provide insights to organisations. And be interesting to hear a little bit about what your thought process is around that, but also what are you teaching the students? Like, what are the important kind of skills and capabilities that are required?
Hopefully the right things. Look, we a couple of years ago in 2018, we set up a data consultancy at the university. We called it the Data Experience. And really this was informed by both the experience we'd had in industry, but also the work particularly we'd done at Swinburne. We had a lot of organisations come through and see what we'd done in terms of building a data and analytics strategy and capability. And we had some interest. We also had a lot of industry asking about talent, and we're sitting on 30,000 students, so surely we should be able to fulfill and broker some of the need for business. So we hire 12-month placement students, higher education undergraduate students in their professional placement year. We offer them a scholarship, and then we train them fairly mercilessly for 12 weeks, so 3-month boot camp on everything from data management and cloud services to visual analytics. But as well, we call them hybrid consultants, as well as business skills, right? Business consultation, right? Presentation skills, relaying and playing back requirements, and all of those things that we find people struggle with. It's that translation role, the ability to talk to the business and understand it and then go and work on it. And so they do 12 weeks and then they go out to industry and they actually do paid employment where they cut their teeth on real engagements. And so they work for organisations, and the revenue that they create covers the scholarship costs and the cost of mentorship and space. And so we're on to our 4th cohort. We had 35 students who've come through and graduated from us. And I think about 93% of those have all got roles with organisations at the back of that in data-related disciplines, which I think is great. But I think the big learning for us is not just to preclude who's included in those cohorts to computer science students. And we're actually seeing massive value in opening this up to people that didn't even know that data was an opportunity for them in the course that they'd taken. So, the idea that physicists are doing it, the idea that people doing working in politics, etc., are doing it, people are working wanting a career in HR and realising the importance of data. It's not long before you realise how much it underpins almost every role, depending on how far you want to take it. So, it's just our take on trying to build future-ready learners, but also identifying that industry is crying out for talent and that we think we know what they need.
I think it's a really amazing model, and you get university students and graduates in, and the biggest criticism is they don't have that practical experience of being able to apply it. And so giving them that practical experience in that environment and giving them the coaching and the training is unbelievable. And I think for me, where I've seen the magic of data and analytics and it hit actionable insights in an organisation is we've got the right capability within your data and analytics team, but also in how to translate that to business actionable insights and the business having the willingness to change, right? Which is a lot of the topics that we've discussed.
I think we're the only consultancy in the world that wants to lose its staff. We want them to be employed. We want them to be employed elsewhere. So it's a unique, because that skill then goes with the organisation. So it's interesting. It's good fun.
It's so important. I think gone now are the days that you come out with a comm degree with an accounting major and off you go from the into the front lines of the workforce, right? Getting your first start is much more complex now and also much more nuanced than it used to be. So I think that a lot of those industry-based learning things are tremendously valuable, not just for the companies, but also for the students to do them. It's definitely going to be the new way coming in. And, I imagine that there's going to be a few disruptors in that area too.
Yeah.
And there needs to be, right?
And there needs to be, right? Exactly, as we've just talked about. You need to respond to that change. So, it's exciting.
It is exciting. I've got a poll that I did before and I forgot to share it, so that was my mistake. But, what is your number one priority for 2021? So resetting strategic priorities. People they've reset their targets, but going into next year and resetting their priorities. And a lot of what we've talked about today is how do you think about resetting your priorities? How do you think about the macro, and how do you use data and analytics to work out how to reset your priorities and the planning process around that? And so I wanted to finish up a really interesting topic that, Charlie, you and I chatted about a lot around resilience. And people think about resilience in terms of personal resilience, but, someone like me, I think about personal resilience, but the whole concept of business resilience, and interested to take your take on that as people start to think about how do they change and pivot on their strategic priorities for 2021.
Very important. I mentioned before about some of the tools that can be used, constructing scenarios and developing plans that are ready for any plausible future that could be thrown at us. So that's important in terms of being resilient. Also, it's important when there are shocks that we don't just react by cutting costs across the board. We find in looking at who's survived, what businesses have survived best during past recessions, is that they do reduce costs strategically to improve operational efficiency, but they also invest money in finding and actioning new opportunities. And sometimes that's just being more optimistic than your competitors. A very good example of that was during the global financial crisis when new vehicle sales tanked. All of the big manufacturers cut back on advertising spending, but one didn't. And that company's share went from 6% of the market to 8%, which was actually an increase in sales for them. And they've been able to hang on to that ever since, just because they were optimistic, kept going. That was Hyundai. So it's very important that you look for opportunities and take advantage of them. And that concept of getting stronger during tough times is actually more than resilience. It's what is sometimes called anti-fragility. That is, you don't break, you don't stay whole, you actually grow stronger. And Hyundai was a very good example of that. In the current crisis that we've had this year, some companies did get stronger, probably more by luck than anything else. Obviously, Harvey Norman, Officeworks, Bunnings, they all had the right thing at the right time. JB Hi-Fi was another, when we were cocooning and setting up home offices and so on. So they were anti-fragile by luck. But what I think companies need to do is to look for how we can not just be resilient in the face of uncertainty, which is always going to be there, but how we are ready to take advantage, to find and take advantage of opportunities so that we can grow when others fail.
Yeah.
I think I'll add to that quickly. Just if you look back, modern business is unbelievably efficient compared to 20, 30, 40 years ago, right? The leaders here now, SpaceX went, Elon Musk in the space of 5 years built a rocket, put an electric car in the rocket and shot it up on the planet into low Earth orbit. And that was done in the space of 5 to 7 years. Now, if you had said in the 1990s or the 1980s that we're going to put a rocket in an electric car and make it in 5 years and shoot it up into space, it'd be incredible. People would just think you were crazy. But that resilience is so important because the speed is going to get even quicker. So if I can think about 30 years from now, when I'm near retirement, I'd imagine that companies for each dollar that they're going to get from the consumer are going to be doing a lot more than they're currently doing now.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting insight. So I wanted to wrap up by saying thank you so much to the panelists for the really insightful conversation today. And you could spend hours talking about this and really thinking about what it looks like. But, time is of the essence, and there's a lot to do in terms of people getting their planning for 2021. And really, some of the messages that I've taken away is really around being bold in actually making some decisions, right? Doing some scenario analysis, but actually making some decisions, taking a risk and actually coming out stronger, right, off the back of it. And so I think that the panel conversation today has been really interesting to unlock some of the thoughts around what does the new world look like? And even though there is uncertainty, there's also a lot of certainty about what we do know, right? And how do we best capitalise on what that looks like? And I had Sarah Devine ask a question around, so any thoughts on how to uncover new data information sources, as sometimes data strategies are incremental and not thinking differently. Not sure, Matt, if you have a kind of parting thought on that.
Look, not really. I think it comes down to what is, as someone I worked with used to say, what's the question you're trying to solve, and then work back from there. I mean, we're always sourcing new data, sometimes at the request of businesses because they're quite clear, and sometimes just by exploring what's possible. So, what have others done? How did they tackle it? What else do they bring to the table in terms of, the way they analysed it? Has someone published this? But really, it's about being creative. What would I do, right? If I needed to explore a new area, what are all the things from the logical to the absolute ridiculous that I might go and source to do that, and then start working through that and prioritising it.
Yeah, no, that's really, really insightful. And so thank you to everyone who's attended today's session. Thank you to the panelists. It's been a fantastic session. And on behalf of James Ciuffetelli and myself, the co-founders of Whiteark, watch this space. We've got our podcast, we've got our content, and we're continuing to bring insider information to our users, our clients, and really our follower base to make sure that people can pivot off the back of COVID and become more resilient and really come out stronger. And so I think a really, really interesting conversation. So thank you so much for your time, and I appreciate everyone's busy and that you guys have contributed to the conversation. I really, really do appreciate it. Bye.
Me too.
All right, thanks, Joe. Love to meet you, Charlie and Tony, too.